Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 348. I'm delighted to welcome back onto the podcast Phil Learney. Phil, how are we doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I was shocked by that number there. I didn't realize you'd done quite as many, but yeah, that's impressive.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Well, our last podcast was 274, I think it was.
Right.
So I've been meaning to get you back on because the discussions and the topics that you brought up in the last episode, a lot of which was bit around night games and strategies in terms of sleep, caffeine, around like evening games. When that went out, I had a few questions from people on like saying that it was really interesting. It got them thinking about what they currently did and maybe some changes. But then they were interested in how you would adapt for different kickoff times.
Yep.
So what we'll do, let's start with the evening. So we work by evening, we sort of meant 7:45s, 8 o'clocks, those sorts of times. Can you give a little bit of a summary around what we spoke around last time around caffeine? We talked about sleep as well, and then we'll take it into some of the different times.
Cool. I think the easiest way to start is would be to kind of give a summary as to what we're trying to do from a biological system standpoint is we're trying to stabilize the body's sleep wake cycles. So if you think about sleep wake cycles, as everybody has a time they wake up, and 16 hours after that theoretically should be the time you go to sleep. In elite sport, that might even be a slightly shorter window. Their wake cycle might be slightly shorter, and we aim at 8 or 9 hours of sleep because there's excessive recovery required because there's excessive output. And again, that depends on the athlete, depends on the sport. But again, we're always looking at the bare minimum. We've got huge data, and I think I mentioned it in the last podcast again. I can't remember exactly what we talked about. It was a while ago, but when we look at players that are going without 7 hours sleep, which we would classify as actually getting close towards sleep deprivation. So a player getting seven hours sleep or less over the course of about 21 days, their injury risk starts to double. So we start to get problems across the board with respect to sleep deprivation affects mental health, cognitive health, cellular health, all of these different things. And the performance markers that we start to look at are huge. I mean, just to give an idea, physical performance, there's an overall drop of about 7.6% in overall performance for somebody who's either sleep deprived or has an irregular sleep wake cycle. So if you think about these young players who are they're getting up at 7, going to bed at 11 every day, and then on a weekend they're maybe skewing things by sitting on their PlayStations. Again, I don't mean stereotype, but that's what footballers tend to do in their off time. They chill out, they take it easy. But again, if they start watching Netflix late at night and they disrupt that pattern, they then fall under this circadian dysregulation bracket. And with that, we start to see drops in skill-based performance of around about 30%. I mean, it's huge, massive numbers. Strength endurance drops by about 10%. Anaerobic power drops by about 6%. Interval training drops by about 6.2. Speed, power, endurance drops by about 5 to 6. And strength drops by about 3% from baseline. So if you're looking at somebody who's looking at, optimizing performance on a physical perspective, sleep deprivation is one of the biggest hits that it will take, or sleep disruption. And again, they can go in two different guises. So the challenge we have is that we're trying to stabilize rhythms and then we're getting these irregular schedules. So if you think about your normal rhythm, so again, we'll use an example, Ben. What's your normal sort of wake up time?
About 5:30.
So about 5:30. So you should theoretically be going to bed at 9:30, and you should be asleep at 9:30, which gives you a 16-hour wake window, which gives you an 8-hour recovery window, which aligns with biology. Now, from the moment you wake up, your nervous system kicks in, your brain kicks in, everything kicks in, and we go into what's classified as the sympathetic state. And this is your nervous system in its kind of on switch. And then it will remain in that on switch for around about 8 hours. And then what it'll do, it'll start to turn that on switch slightly down. And this is what we call a switch. It's a switch into a parasympathetic system, which is your body's rest and digest system. So 8 hours after we've woken up, our body's then going rest, digest, and then what it's doing 8 hours after that, it's going to sleep, recover. And that's part of this process. Now, the challenge we have with the late kickoff is obviously if somebody is using up that peak cognitive and physical output in that first 8 hours, when we get into the next day, which happens to be when a lot of these kickoffs are occurring, the nervous system is dampened down. We're not as fired up as we would be. So this goes back to kind of the common problem we've had is that if we look at this is an energy equation, right? And if we look historically, so again, those anybody who's listening who's in their 40s or 50s will remember the days of glucose. Glucose drinks. It was an athlete thing. It was a Lucozade and Gatorade if you were in the US. And what it was is that there was this energy crisis in essence. Is that people were starting to struggle with energy because the demands of their social lives and the demands of their work lives were starting to exceed this 9-5, this classical 9-5. So the work schedule changed and the demands on the human being changed. Nervous systems were getting challenged more. So people were now starting to feel tired when they shouldn't be because sleep was getting deprived because the stresses of work, the stresses of family life, the stresses of modern day life. And what they needed something like a pick me up. It's like this thing of, when would you see Lucozade? You'd see Lucozade when people were in hospital, right?
Yeah.
So you give them Lucozade and you give them grapes. Grapes being the highest glycemic fruit you can practically get. So it's like eating pure sugar. So what we're doing there is that we're giving something to somebody based off a symptom. The symptom is a lack of energy, so we take sugar. Now, what then happened is, even from a cultural standpoint, is then sugar started to get alienated, started to become this thing you didn't have, you didn't take, you didn't, and that's when caffeine and nicotine started to grow. And obviously, in amongst that, we've got all these other subcultures where, remember that Coca-Cola up until I think 1923 still had cocaine in it.
Yeah.
So people were looking for solutions to a lack of energy years ago. It was this thing of lacking energy, take something. And this is the culture that we've now driven into, is that even in sport, we have this thing of, oh, if you feel a bit tired, take something. But what we've got to understand is that whatever we choose to take is going to, it's going to do what it's meant to do. It will wake us up. But there's a second repercussion to that. So if you take glucose, what's going to happen is your body's going to go into probably hyperglycemia. Then it's going to crash and go into hypoglycemia. That's what happens when you spike blood glucose and it then crashes. So it's great prior to performance because then you kind of offset it and you use it for fuel but for somebody who's just sat at a desk and they consume a high glycemic glucose based drink, an hour or so later they're going to feel more tired than they did to start with. They're going to get this temporal boost, but then it's going to crash. Now the same thing occurs with caffeine, is that people then take caffeine. And what caffeine does, it jacks up your nervous system. So it turns your nervous system on, it affects your adrenaline levels, et cetera, et cetera. And what it does, it blocks a compound called adenosine, which drives sleep. So it stops that sleep pressure being sensed by the body. It doesn't get rid of it, it just blocks it being sensed. So we block the adenosine receptors in the brain. And when we do that, we've got to remember that those receptors are going to get blocked for a period's time. And that's to do with what we classify as the metabolic half-life of a compound. Now, the challenge you have with caffeine is the metabolic half-life of caffeine is about 6 to 8 hours. So when you consume caffeine in that late afternoon, it's still blocking one of the key chemicals that's going to get us into deep restorative sleep from reaching its endpoint. So when you've got an 8 p.m. kickoff, if you've got somebody whose normal pattern is, let's say, 7-11 or 6-10 or 5-9 or whatever their pattern is, they're a few hours from biologically being asleep. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to cheat the system. And again, what in football, in the culture of football, we've seen this massive intake of, firstly was caffeine. Then what they did is they were like, well, we can't just keep having these big hits of caffeine. So what we're going to do, we're going to have smaller hits. So the smaller hits of caffeine started to become things like caffeine gum, started to become a snuzz, started to become all these different things. These are these low-level stimulants that we could take all the time.
Yeah.
Again, what happens then is we start to interfere with sleep quality. So then we start to interfere with recovery, and then we're in this perpetual cycle of you are constantly battling tiredness, in essence. So if you're taking, snus, or you're taking nicotine, or you're taking caffeine, or whatever it might be late at night, you're going to interfere with the quality and depth of that sleep. You'll still fall asleep. Most people will, because most people are in chronic sleep debt, but you'll fall asleep, but that quality of sleep is going to be hindered. So now we're tired, right? So when we start to get into these late kickoffs, the challenge we've got is the nervous system's got to get jacked up. Now, if you think about, people watching this, right? It doesn't matter whether it's a local, regional, recreational game for the school, game in front of 50,000 people. If you've got a kickoff at 8 p.m. and you are passionate about what you do and you love what you do and blah, 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 and if we talk Premier League, if you're walking out in front of these, 50 to 100,000 people, I don't really think you need caffeine to jack your nervous system up. Now, if you do, you're probably at the latter end of your career and you're probably, you know, that doesn't inspire you physiologically anymore. But that feeling that we get, and this is often when you get people who've never, you're going out for your first game ever for a Premier League club, that nervous system gets overwhelmed. And then we get anxiety and we start to get, and this is what happens with players when they play their very first game. And a lot of people relate to this. The first time you stepped out on front of a stage or on a big event, whatever it might be, your nerves get the better of you and you make mistakes. So there's a fine line between stimulation and overstimulation, but there's also a very fine line with respect to what can we stimulate without hindering the overall output. And again, we've kind of gone round in a big circle there to some degree. But it's important that if we start to talk about kickoff times, we need to understand biologically what state the body is in at these different kickoff times. So an 8 p.m. kickoff, you give a player caffeine, you're going to need to give them a sedative.
Yeah.
Right? You've got no choice because you've jacked the nervous system up to the point that they now do not want to sleep. Physiologically, their body doesn't want to calm the nervous system down, doesn't want to, spike all the chemicals that it needs to do what it's meant to do, and therefore you won't sleep. And if you do, your depth of sleep is going to be very, very shallow. So you might be almost dozing all night, which means the next day you're now in sleep debt. You're not fully recovered. Your soft tissue that was damaged from the game hasn't recovered fully. So now your injury risk is higher. And now we're in this perpetual cycle. So when we look at sleep and when we look at recovery, it is critical to athletes. And if we don't get that right, we've got a problem. And what we've got to understand is that what do we need for a game at a particular time when it comes to, and we could get into sports supplements and things like this if you want, and we can start to talk about what do these things do and what do we need them for. And this all comes down, and I actually got in a little discussion on LinkedIn yesterday about this same thing where people were talking about supplements, and they were saying, look, supplements need to be applied to somebody who needs those supplements. So, for example, sodium bicarb. Sodium bicarb is a phenomenal supplement. It's not much use to footballers though, because the margin for error is very minimal. But endurance athletes, hugely beneficial. Creatine for a footballer, hugely beneficial. Short bouts, explosive work, blah, 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 works perfectly. We can get into nitrates, we can get into beta-alanine, we can get into all these different things. But fundamentally, it's is it fit for purpose? And are the negatives outweighing the positives? And when it comes to having caffeine late at night, the negatives far outweigh the positives. And we shouldn't really need a stimulant because the occasion in itself should be stimulating enough. You with me? And there's also the chance that we might overstimulate if we add a chemical stimulant in or a synthetic stimulant in. Does that make sense?
100%. I think it's really interesting with when you refer to like adrenaline, especially in these environments where you've got a number of different fans and all the rest of it, because it makes complete sense. I'd be really interested to speak to players and see how much of it is actually just a routine that they take caffeine at 2 hours before kickoff, an hour before kickoff, just because that's what they do, and they don't actually think about the kickoff time.
Yep, it's this thing of it's what we've always done.
Yeah,
like the ritual. You see players going out and they'll tap the club badge before they run out. It's a ritual. It's a thing that's become part of the culture. One of the challenges we have when we go into football teams or any teams, to be any corporate teams, it doesn't matter who we go into. We're challenging culture. We're challenging what has become the norm. And unfortunately, caffeine in almost all cultures has become a norm. It's become a thing that people do. You go into look at the Wolf of Wall Street. Wolf of Wall Street, people are like, well, blah, blah. But this is what that life was like at that time.
Yeah.
That is what people did. They were like, we need to work 20-hour days. So how do we do that? We take things that keep us incredibly awake and alert, and we then take things that shut us right down. And that's what they did. But then years later, they were like, we can't sustain this. And this is this thing with football, is that one of the biggest dangling carrots that I will give to any young footballer is career longevity. Is that football is this sport where you've got the prospect of earning huge amount of money for very short periods of time, which can be nullified in a second. You know,
Mm.
you get an injury, that could be your career. And when we know this, there are enough footballers out there who've been at the pinnacle, who have fallen from that grace very, very quickly, and who've made huge amounts of money in a very short period of time, but had to then live with the culture of their lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
I remember dealing with a footballer years ago, and his first paycheck, the first thing he did, he put a down payment on a house, and he bought himself a brand new BMW. That was the first thing he did with his very first paycheck, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Mm.
There's nothing wrong with that. The challenge that he has is he's bought straight into the culture of how he's expected to live.
Yeah.
Expected to roll up in all this designer gear. He's expected to turn up in this beautiful car. He's expected to have this flash house. The problem is that expectancy is coming from a place where nobody understands what's around the next corner. Is that if that player now gets injured, who's going to pay all those bills? Who's financially advising these people? And again, I'm sure you've had people on the podcast who've talked about this. Financial security of footballers, because people look at them and go, oh, well, what have they got to complain about? Look, they're going to earn money for 5 years.
Mm.
And
It's
then
relative, isn't it? Relative to what they earn and what they spend.
that's going to last forever. And
Yeah.
in that time, in those 5 years, they're expected to live like footballers.
Mm.
And that's the culture, right? They're expected to wear certain things. They're expected to do certain things. And unfortunately, that digs into that capital massively. They're not expected to invest in things. They're not expected to invest and be savvy with their money. They're expected to blow it. And that's part of the culture. And one of the things that we do, and again, a bit of a tangent around performance, but it's the same thing. We're challenging culture. We go into clubs, they're always like, yeah, but we have a culture around coffee. I'm like, that's fine. Coffee is fine. Caffeine's the problem.
Mm.
Remember, they're two different things.
Mm.
Caffeine is a compound that we can find in coffee. We can also find coffee that doesn't have that compound in it.
Mm.
So is the culture around coffee or is the culture around caffeine? We've got to ascertain that. And if we can maintain the culture around drinking cups of coffee, hot beverages, whatever it might be, we can also maintain the culture. It's a bit like, you go into any kind of social setup, you and your friends, you will do certain things, you'll eat certain things, you'll drink certain things, it's like when people quit drinking, all of a sudden their social circle changes. Why? Because they don't drink anymore. So when we're almost trying to reverse engineer this in organizations, is we're looking at that culture and going, this culture is broken.
Mm.
I talked to you just off camera just before we had the thing, and we were talking about budgets and the use of budgets. Is that we went into a club and they were spending, I think it was something like £2,500 a month on caffeine gum. I mean, that's an obscene amount of caffeine gum, and this is something people just throw in their mouths at any time of the day with no rules around it. No, you shouldn't be taking it after a certain point. Blah blah blah. It's just there, readily available. Take a box and use it. And now what you've got is you've got these people who've got nervous systems that are low level, stimulated all day, which means they never shut off. And again, we talked about, physical performance stats. You look at mental health performance, somebody who's sleep deprived or has circadian dysregulation, the kind of criteria I talked about before, their depressive symptoms go up by 35%. Their anxiety symptoms go up by 40%, and their mood disturbances go up by 60%. This then affects their relationships. It affects their ability to handle stress, and they've got stress. People might look from the outside and go, they've got plenty of money. What have they got to stress about? Being a celebrity in any guise is stressful. They're getting harassed by press. They're being scrutinized on their every move. They're this, that, the other, and that can then become overwhelming because of a lack of sleep or a lack of recovery. And then the player gets injured. And we see this. We see players that have been harassed constantly by the press. Ultimately, what happens is a lot of them get injured
Mm.
because they're not recovering, because they're not sleeping well, and they're not sleeping well because they're stressed about the pressure that's been put on them by society. And if we went in on a science level, if we check their blood markers, all the stress markers in their blood would be up, and it'd be a problem. So recovery is everything in this space. And it's also adaptation, right? We talked about training before, is that when somebody trains, in order to adapt to that training, and remember, football's a skill-based sport. In order to acquire skills, you've got to consolidate memories. If you don't sleep, you don't consolidate memories. So skill acquisition goes out the window. So there's all of these different things. And when we look at negatives versus positives. There is no, there isn't a single marker that I can think of in the realms of giving someone a stimulant late in the day as to the benefits outweighing the negatives. It just doesn't happen. So we've got to challenge the culture. We've got to change the culture. We've got to understand what people are doing, and we've got to give them options. And we developed a product based around society. If society wasn't ingrained the way it was, we wouldn't have needed to produce that product. We created a nootropic drink that supports the preparation of sleep. Which again was something that would replace the drink that people typically have at that time. People are grabbing energy drinks at 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We have to give them an option. We can't just tell them not to do it.
Yeah.
Give them something to replace the habitual behavior they had before. We know this from habit and behavioral change. It isn't a matter of just stopping someone doing something. Stop doing that. You've got to give them something to do instead of. But yeah, sorry, tangents everywhere.
No, 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 not at all. I think the thing that comes to mind with this is like the education between, because I think if you ask a lot of coaches and players and you say, what's the number one recovery tool? A lot of people are going to go to sleep.
Yeah.
But then the habits of having that caffeine gum, having caffeine late in the day don't line up with the sleep quality. So
I mean, it's like a simple question, man. And going back on that historical piece that I talked about, right? Back in the late 70s, early 80s, if you were tired, what did you do? You grabbed a glucose drink, you grabbed an energy drink, and they were marketed as such, energy drink. Then what we do, and again, this is just a matter of asking people, what do you do? What do you do when you're tired to, patch that up, to scaffold it, should we say? What do you do? We put scaffolding around it, right? And so if you're tired, what do? You reach for a stimulant. If you've got a bit of brain fog, you might reach for a nootropic. And it's this thing of, if we have this symptom, we take this thing instead of looking at what caused the symptom. And if you've got people who are in chronic sleep debt, that's what's causing the problem. We've got this patch, but we can't keep patching, because we know what happens when you keep patching. It's a bit like injuries. You go back in the history of injuries. What did they used to do? Particularly, and again, there was a big scandal around this, but what did they do in the NFL? What do they used to give players? If they're in pain, what do they give them? They give them cortisone. Give them cortisone injections, right? Give them cortisone injections and painkillers. And it worked short term. They were like, this is brilliant. It's a patch. Solve the problem. The problem is that long term it didn't work. You want to shorten your career, take anti-inflammatories, take painkillers all the time. Because when your body's saying, don't do this, you'll do it. If you want a shortcut to a short career, that's the way to do it. But they didn't realize that. And did the organizations involved really care? And what you got to remember in the world of football, the world of football is you have got millions of players. There is no shortage. You look at the NBA. The NBA invests so much money into recovery, sleep, performance, restoration, because they've got the smallest elite player pool in the world. They've got so few players to pick from. Whereas in football, it's a global game, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Your superstar player could get injured tomorrow. You can buy someone who will replace them. Doesn't matter who they are. And you look at the players that have extended their longevity, who've continuously performed again and again and again. Look at what they do. Do you think Ronaldo, Ronaldo's a great example, maybe not as much now, but Ronaldo, whenever we said he should be retiring, he got how many years extra out of himself by looking at his nutrition? Do you think he was smashing caffeine at 8 p.m. kickoffs?
Yeah.
Think Haaland did that? Does that? And this is the thing, is that they've relied on their own intelligent uptake because the club culture didn't work. And they got ribbed. I know for a fact that Haaland got absolutely hammered by his peers. He went in, he's eating this bizarre diet. Everybody's like, what's he doing that for? Why are you doing this? And then what happens, the same thing that happens in culture, is that people and he just brushed it off. He was like, I don't care what people think. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Unfortunately, he was that kind of character. But what could have easily happened is he could have gone, oh, I don't conform here, so I need to start conforming. So I'll do what they do. I'll stop doing what I think is right, and I'll do what they tell me is right. But instead, he stuck to his guns. Then what happened is all of a sudden people are like, what's he doing? Because it seems to be working, and it's those showcases that help us. Often when we go into clubs or large corporate environment, I'm looking at the influencers. I'm going, who is there in this team that will make uniform change? If they start adopting something, will everyone else adopt it? Because you've always got those people, right, that everybody else looks up to and goes, it's like at school, right? There's always that one person that everybody looks up to and go, yeah, let's mirror their behaviors.
Regardless of what it is.
Regardless of what it is, right? And there was the nice guys and there was the assholes, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, people resonate towards the assholes because the assholes were often the popular people. They were popular because nobody wanted to get on the wrong side of them because they were threatening. And it's this thing, right? So we're looking at this thing when we go into clubs, we're going, right, who are the cultural drivers? Who are the early adopters? Who are the people that are interested in this? And if we can convert them, we bring 10 players along with them. So it's important that we do that. And again, there's so much there, but it's this thing of we've got a problem, take something for that problem. I can't sleep. I go to Team GP. GP goes, what are your symptoms? I can't sleep. Here's a sedative.
Yeah.
No thought around, and again, I think we talked about it in the last one with the Dele Alli podcast when he was with Gary Neville. And he'd alluded to the fact that a large percentage of the Premier League use sedatives on a regular basis. And is that to do with, and is that more prevalent in the bigger clubs who get the late kickoffs because of TV coverage? I don't know. But I'm sure we can find some stats that probably marry up with that.
Well, that's one reason I wanted to get you back on, because I think we're seeing this kickoff time now extend across the day. So we're talking about 8 o'clock, but last season we also had 8:15, so they're getting even later as well. But then we've also got the other end of the day, which I think would be interesting to get your thoughts on, because we spoke about the late ones and we've touched on that a little bit now. But you've also got sort of your 11s, half 11s, 12:30s. So we're looking at the complete opposite end of the day now. So how much would change if you were advising players, advising coaches? How much would change when we switch the kickoff time to that sort of period of the day?
Not a lot, because all we do is we need to find a baseline, right? So again, let's use an example, right? So your baseline is that we know that if you're getting up at, let's say 6, just because it's easier on numbers. So let's say you get up at 6. I know there's, from that point, if we get the biological, signals right at that point of the day, is that we expose your optic nerve to light, which is critical. And again, you're seeing this quite a bit in clubs. You're seeing them with the glasses. I think, again, we talked about this last time. I think Wolves had been papped with all these glasses on, and the glasses that fire light into the optic nerve. And we use this a lot when people are traveling. We use this with Formula One guys. Is that when they're traveling, is that when the sun comes up at your destination, you put the glasses on, because we're trying to re-establish a new biological rhythm. So if you get up in the morning and you expose your optic nerve to light, again, I maybe touched on this last time, is that, you saw Liverpool shortly, and ironically, after a conversation that we'd had with them, several weeks later, they were seen walking around bright and early in the morning around Liverpool city centre. Every single player, and they're like, well, what's the team doing out walking around in, this sunlight? And, and I'm not saying that we instigated that, but
no, we did. Well,
we did. Yeah, well, I think we probably did. But it's this thing of, right, they've started their biological rhythm. So now when we start that, we can delay it, we can mess around with it and do all these different things, and we can acclimatize to different peaks. But really the problem is the frequency of games. Is that you can't really do that with the frequency of games. If I've got an athlete, so if I've got a runner who's got, probably 10 events in a year, we can manipulate the system a little bit. And again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but we can manipulate the system so they peak at the right times. So there's a whole load of stuff where we know biologically that strength peaks and endurance peaks at certain times. One athlete I've done some work with in the last couple of weeks, I just asked her, I said, historically, can you pinpoint a period of the day in which you have hit all your PBs? And she said, yeah, 3 to 5. So 3 to 5 is a biological window of performance. We're not saying that's categoric, but she's given me a good indication that between the hours of 3 and 5. So when she's traveling, we can get her to sleep in, to stay up late, do all these different things. So whatever time the event is, it sits in that 3 to 5 window biologically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
You're almost manipulating time to some degree, right? Now, the frequency of football games, you can't do that.
Mhm.
If there was one big final, maybe you would. Certainly with teams that are traveling into Europe, and certainly in the pre-season, there'll be a lot of them going to Australia and Singapore and various other places, I'm sure. So then they've got jet lag, right? So we've got to acclimatize them faster, which is part of what we do as a brand. We do jet lag mitigation, but again, slightly more complex. But with the altering kickoff times, all we're doing is we're trying to look at biologically where someone is going to be, and we're going to try and improve that performance. So if I've got somebody at an 8 p.m. kickoff, the biggest thing we've got there is that their alertness levels have dropped. So their alertness levels have dropped because their nervous system is shutting down. Now, I don't need to stimulate the nervous system because the game itself will do that. So that's going to jack them up. It's going to get them wired. It's going to get them, we hope. If it doesn't, again, like I said, it's probably time to start, hanging your boots up.
Mm.
But that's going to happen anyways. You might have family there or, 1,000 fans or whatever it might be. But there's enough there to stimulate your nervous system. The other problem we've got is cognitively your brain is shutting down. So what we want to do is we want to give the brain something to fire it back up again. So this is where we can intelligently use nootropics, because nootropics aren't going to impact your sleep. Might give you some wild dreams, but they're not going to impact your sleep. So we can utilize a tool there that's going to enhance the thing that we know has plummeted. The other things are going to be looked after anyways. Now, the challenge you have with caffeine, so again, there's always this discussion here. So if it's an 8 p.m. kickoff and I take caffeine, caffeine's a synthetic, it's not synthetic, it's a natural compound, but it's essentially, it's a chemical that's going into your body that has a half-life, which means it's going to be in your system for a certain period of time before it gets cleared out of your system. Now, if we do that, it doesn't matter what you do after the game. You can do as much breath work and all of these things to calm your nervous system as you want. Your nervous system will remain highly wired until that starts to wear off.
Yeah.
The cool thing about after a game, if it's just the game that's wired you, we can calm you down. There's nothing overriding it. So you could do some breath work after a game, which again is the most accessible way of calming someone's nervous system. You can do some breath work after a game, which is going to calm your nervous system and help you sleep. And we could establish a good sleep hygiene routine as well, which somebody reestablishes and goes back into, which again is another kind of process. But again, that's what we would do. Whereas if somebody's got a 11 o'clock kickoff in the morning, could we use caffeine? Yeah, we could.
Mm.
Do we need it? Is the big question.
Yeah.
Is it going to enhance performance? Big question. Or could we just use caffeine to establish their start point of their day, which means we establish a rhythm that is consistent? So there's debates both ends, and again, it depends on the propensity of the player. It depends on their what they're like. It's a bit like when you'll have people in your friendship circle, Ben, that they're just completely wired all the time. You probably don't need to give them caffeine. And again, there's more science behind it than that. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to take people who are already quite wired and make them more wired. We see this a lot in fight sports. Is that fighters train in these little camps, and then they come to this fight. Now all of a sudden, and again, they might only have 4 fights a year, big fights a year. So they go out, and they're nervous, and their adrenaline's high, and their anxiety's high, and they've got people there watching them that they know intimidate them, and blah blah blah. And then the nutritionist gives them a ton of caffeine that they don't normally have. Now the nervous system is going to override. We go into what we call is a state of hyper arousal, which means the body starts to shut down. It just goes, "This is great, I feel, but I can't concentrate." Now you imagine a fighter, and most fight sports are to do with composure. They're to do with, seeing what the opponent's doing, keeping your heart rate down, and what you've done here is you've just jacked up someone's heart rate, which means you've now just moved their fatigue points lower. So they're gonna conk out quicker. If we elevate the heart rate of a footballer, what happens to their fuel? They use it faster.
Yeah.
So there's all of these things that come into play. But does it change with those different kickoffs? It does. It becomes a debate. But we also need to consider, really, in the grand scheme of things, is if they're going to use a stimulant, is that stimulant going to be cleared by the time they get into bed? And if it is, we're cool. The varying kickoffs, what we're going to get is, I would imagine, if they maintain them for years and years and years, we'll start to get some really solid data around that. I mean, there's solid data right now about the number of goals scored between evening and afternoon kickoffs. I mean, it's huge. It's like a 200, 300 goal difference. But you can put that down to, are they teams better at attacking, or are they just poorer at defending? It's, you don't know. But again, I'm sure an analyst could look at the games and go, right, what's happening here? You get these real, and there's some incredible analysts in football, experienced players who are just incredible. They can look at the game and go, look, that player's moving there and doing this and blah, blah, blah. And this is the reason this happened. And incredible analysts, and again, that's probably the most fascinating part when I watch a football game and you hear these pundits, and some of these pundits are sharp as hell, and they're talking strategy. And again, that's what I resonate towards. I look at that, I listen to them, and I'm like, that strategic piece is incredible. I'm less interested in the game itself. I'm more interested in what's the strategy around winning, right? Which is phenomenal. But yeah, there's all this stuff, and again, requires huge cognitive demand, physiological demand, etc., etc. What's the problem you're going to get with a footballer late at night is that their cognitive system's not as turned on as it should be. So what do? We get their brain working a little bit better, so they can focus a little bit more instead of their body going, I'm 2 hours from being fast asleep here.
We spoke last time as well. I think this is where people took a lot from, was you spoke about sleep and using sleep in the day as well. That's with a night game, obviously. The other thing I wanted to ask was the differences nutritionally. So obviously, if we've got like an early kickoff, say at 12 o'clock or whatever, we've obviously got less time from the player waking to kickoff time to an evening. What would you advise, focus on, prioritize nutritionally in that time?
I would always say there's a baseline. So let's assume no game, right? No game, but training, right? So no game, but training. So we can assume energy outputs the same, if not potentially higher. Training days, you probably expend more energy than on a game day, but let's assume they're somewhere comparable. So let's say you've got a baseline. Now the baseline remains the same for every player, because timing's got a lot to do with nutrition as well. When do we eat and how do we eat? So that player, irrespective of whether it's an evening kickoff or an afternoon kickoff, what they do is they wake up, they eat their breakfast at the normal time, they eat it at the lunch at the normal time, they eat it at, as long as it doesn't conflict with the game. And then what I would do is from a nutritional standpoint, is there is a pre and post game protocol that you follow, and an intra game. So when does that protocol kick in? It kicks in an hour before a game or 90 minutes before a game, and it continues until 90 minutes after a game. And it just becomes this separate window. And that nutrition sits. So what's your pre-game meal? Irrespective of what time of day it is, your pre-game meal is always your pre-game meal. It's the same thing. It's ritualistic. And you'd see this. I always remember, one of the rugby players back in the day, Austin Healy, and he always started his day on game days. He'd always get up and he'd eat a bacon sandwich. And nutritionists would be like, this isn't nutritionally sound, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately he was getting not a great source of protein, but he was getting a bunch of energy, calories. He was, I can't remember what type of bread or whatever it might be, but he was getting a ton of calories. But the whole thing there is that he would then hyperhydrate because of the salt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this was why he did it, but ultimately he's going to then consume a lot more fluids because he's had the salt and the sodium levels from the bacon. Now, bacon in itself, if you think about bacon's high in sodium. Sodium's electrolyte that we are going to need to almost you can put someone into a hypotonic state by giving them high concentration electrolytes before they actually kick off, which means there's no dehydration prior to starting. And the last thing we want is a player to be dehydrated before they even start. So we need something that creates rehydration before that point. And again, this is the difference between hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic drinks. Isotonic you would take kind of during the event. Hypotonic you'd either take before or hyper, depending on, again, the status and a bunch of other myriads in there, but in essence, we want to get someone hydrated and then maintain hydration throughout. So there'd just be a protocol. I just go, look, there's a pre-game, post-game protocol. What do you eat before a game? And that remains the same every time. And if it remains the same every time, we can then potentially change it, a bit like doing a split test. We can change it now and again and see if there's any benefit. So you might go from somebody they might have a bowl of oats 90 minutes before a game. The next person might have a bacon sandwich. We don't know.
Mm.
But then there's also that placebo effect of, what is their thing? Is it too heavy? Is it too light? Is it this, that? And that becomes a very individualized thing. Is that you'll have some people who eat jelly babies before they play. That's fine. No problem. Just make sure that you do it consistently. It's always before the game, and there's nothing wrong with that.
That makes sense. Makes sense. It's very easy to apply that as well, isn't it? Because we can, regardless of that kickoff time, we just put it in either side.
Overcomplication lowers compliance.
Yeah.
And the thing is that it's all well and good if there was one S&C coach and one nutritional coach for every player out there, great. But it isn't the case. Is that you've got a nutritionist in a club who's got to look after, the A team, the B team, the reserves, and they've got a lot to do. So what's the biggest thing is feed them and give them access to huge amounts of nutrients. We're doing some work with Brentford next year, and the food they serve there is incredible. Incredible. There's consideration on every level. There's fats, there's good proteins, there's loads of hydration, it's all there. And if there's players not consuming enough, words will be said. They'll intervene and they'll go, look, you need to consume more calories.
Mm.
So yeah, it's interesting, but overcomplication reduces compliance. And ultimately, the biggest issue we have here is that people don't do what they're meant to do. We do a bit of work with one of the big universities in the US, an interesting American Football University. And interesting, they came to me and they said we have a 10% compliance. So they used to have a squad of 150. They've had to cut it down this season because of new rules. They have a squad of 100. And he said within that squad of 100, we get 10%. So we get 10 players, are what we call the compliance players. They'll do everything we tell them to a T. They'll do the nutrition, they'll do the training, they'll do the recovery, they'll control sleep, they'll do all of this stuff. And he said historically, he goes, for the last 5 years, every single person in that 10% has been drafted. Yet there's still 90% of the players won't do what they're told.
Yeah.
And you're looking at something there that is a lot of these players will have worked their entire life for. It's not even, it's multiple generational wealth that you will acquire getting to that level in the NFL.
Yeah.
It's a bit like you going into a Premier League club and going, look, we have 10% of the players comply with what we tell them. Now, what will happen in the next few years is they'll start to be data start to pull from that. And they'll go, right, the 10% of players that complied, they're still playing. 90% that didn't have all finished their careers and they're or they've gone down leagues or they got injured or whatever it might be. And we'll see these correlations over the next few years. And it'll be interesting to see. And as we see more and more data being garnered, more and more of it will point back to sleep. I can guarantee you that.
I think it's really interesting. Like you say, the reflection on that will be really interesting, and especially around player availability.
Yeah.
Because that's a massive ability in itself, isn't it? Regardless of where you sit within a squad, if you're constantly available, the likely chance is that you're going to play a fair amount of minutes throughout the season. Whether you're a starter or not, you're going to get minutes.
And you're not challenging the body on all these other levels. You get a player who avoids social media, their stress levels will be less.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. And I remember, Fergie with the kind of big Man U team of old, and he banned them all.
Yeah.
From using social media. You couldn't get away with that now, I don't think, but
No.
he was like, no. And he also controlled press.
Yeah.
Which none of the other managers dared do. He stopped press getting in their faces when they needed to focus or concentrate on things. And there was all of these things. And again, people will reflect on these and look back and go, oh, there was a manager who used to do that. And he wouldn't have done it based off, anecdote or science. It's logic. He'll have gone, They've gone, look, when I see my players on these devices, they get stressed. So I'll stop them going on the devices. And obviously, it's a different world now, but there's certain things you're not allowed to tell people they can and can't do. But ultimately, it comes down to better decisions. And if I was a professional athlete, I played decent sport at decent levels, but would never. If I knew about all this back then, maybe I might have made a career out of it. I don't know.
Mm.
Who knows? Who knows?
Well, it falls on the player a lot of this, doesn't it? Like for
Yeah.
them to
Oh,
think
ownership.
themselves our socials and control all that.
Ownership.
Yeah.
Yep. Ownership. If you own it, you've got it. You look at the players that really stand out in the Premier League. Every single one of them owns their own shit.
Mm.
They look after it themselves, or they bring in outside parties to help them coordinate and navigate it. Players who pay to have their own nutritionist. You know, uh, yeah, huge. Invest in yourself, right?
Yeah, 100%. Phil, I want to just finish up with it's probably we've only got 5 minutes or so, but
Sorry, I just looked at the time. I was like, "Where's that gone?"
no,
Like,
it's fine. It's fine. I just wanted to bring this up because this seems to be something that's definitely coming up within off season quite a bit, and that's around body fats with players.
yep.
I wanted to just get your perspective on players are bringing up they want to reduce body fat, especially in off season, and the link to performance as well.
Okay, so this is an interesting one. It's very nuanced, right? So if we look at kind of the core premise, body fat's not. We've got to disregard it as a health metric because in professional football, it shouldn't ever be regarded as a health metric because it's not going to kill someone. Nobody's walking around with body fat of some of the players in the early 80s, perhaps, but not in today's modern game. It's a performance variable. So it's an energy reserve, which is great, but we don't really tap into that reserve unless we run out of our primary sources, which in the game of football, it should never happen.
Mm.
If you've got somebody who's not eating before a game, maybe, but that should never happen. So assuming everything's in space, body fat is non-functional mass. It doesn't do anything. It has no purpose. Survival, yes, but in the game of football, it has no purpose. So it's dead weight. So it's going to affect force equations. So we know that excessive body fat impacts sprint speed, vertical jumps, agility, so how quick someone can turn and accelerate. So, and we know, from studies, and again, I can't off the top of my head remember any, but there are studies. 2020, 2023. There was quite a few studies. I can't remember by who. Probably because the people that they were by were probably have the most complex names under the sun, which tends to be the case with researchers. But leading players consistently outperformed in agility and explosiveness tests. I know that for a fact. Endurance, faster fatigue because you carry more weight around. It's a bit like me putting a weighted vest on you. You're going to fatigue faster, right? Sprint capacity drops, everything. And again, there's data across the board and fairly recent data. And when we talk about recent data, stuff in the last 5 years, there's a ton of stuff around it. Recovery injury risk, again, same thing, because increased mechanical load. So if you're carrying around more body fat, there's more load on your joints, on your hips, your knees, your ankles. So every time you jump, you land, there's more impact. So all of that. Fatigue can affect sort of cognitive sharpness, various bits and pieces. But again, there's position specific stuff. We've got to understand what is required. So what do players need? You look at midfielders, you look at forwards. They require speed. They need agility, and that can be the difference between them beating a player and not beating a player, right? And we're talking margins here.
Mm.
So for those, low body fat is always going to be big. The lower the body fat, fundamentally, the better. I think Ronaldo rolls around at about 7% typically. Most of the lean guys are somewhere around 7 to probably 13%, somewhere around there. Which again, I would see as should be fairly standard for most players across the board. Goalkeepers, different. Goalkeepers can, they don't need sprint performance, but they need vertical jumps and blah blah blah. But again, there's more to do with skill and agility and blah blah blah. It's that focus of where do you spend your time? What do you spend your time improving? Now, again, in football, it's a skill-based sport, but most players pick up their fundamental skills at a very early age. they don't really enhance them. What they do is they enhance their understanding of the game and their ability to read the game. So they work better as units, they work better as a team. Again, we talked off camera just very briefly about it, is that, you can pay for the best team in the world. Ultimately, if they don't communicate together, it's not going to work. They're going to be good, but it's going to be disbanded. It's not going to work as a unit. So it's those things of what are the things that they should be working in off season. Recovery should be a big one, but there shouldn't really be an issue with recovery. People say, "Oh, the off season's for me to recover." I'm like, why have you not been managing recovery throughout the season?
Yeah.
Be the question, right? If you need a bit of time off, you might have some players with some niggled injuries that need a bit of rehab. So off season's got to be lots of rehab or prehab, preventing injury happen. It's got to be maintaining body fat, and the challenge you've got there with off season is that there's more indulgence and less activity.
Yeah.
Which again, you mentioned before, is that footballers, they tend to stay leaner now throughout the course of the year, which is great. I think, given the sport, I think it's great that happens. But it's and also there's that element of, in the off season, is it because they just want to look really good? And I've had this with athletes, professional athletes who come to me and go, I want to have a six pack. I'm like, but the six pack doesn't function. Us spending a bunch of time. Remember, the six pack isn't just about being lean; it's about training your abs.
Yeah.
And I'm like, look, we train your abs in a functional sense. Is that all of your ab training comes? We're not going to do crunches, we're not going to do leg raises, we're not going to do any of that, because it all comes from functional stuff. So we're going to do a ton of rotational stuff because that's applicable. Rugby players have dealt with a load of American football as well, but rotation's a big thing. And that's where they get the ab development, from rotation. Martial artists all have wicked abs because they rotate all the time.
Yeah.
Rotate the lower and the upper torso in different planes. So they get that ab development. Whereas in football, you don't always get that much ab development. There's abs because people are lean enough to be able to see them, but you don't get that development. So what you don't want is a player off season training for aesthetics.
Mm.
You want them training for function. And ultimately, that's what pays the bills. And that would always be my comeback. I'd be like, look, what pays your bills? Looking great? You might get a front cover magazine or something like that. So that'd be the argument they come back with. They'd be like, yeah, but I was on front of GQ and I got paid X amount for that. I'm like, yeah, but it's nothing compared to your weekly wage, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there'd always be an argument. They'd always come back with something. But is it part of their personal brand? Being lean, was that part of Ronaldo's personal brand? Yeah, I think it was.
Mm.
But it was also part of his performance.
Mm.
He wasn't lean because of his brand. He was lean because of the performance, right?
Yeah.
The byproduct. So, and it's understanding what comes first, right? So I think, body fat, I think players should keep it in check. Slightly more tricky in the off season. Remember, off season used to be, and alcohol used to be a big thing in football, right? I remember back in the day, we used to go to Newcastle quite a bit for nights out, and we'd go to a place called Julie's. And Julie's was always, it didn't matter what night of the week you went, it was full of Newcastle players. Les Ferdinand would be in there. It would be like, and he was the big name at the time. And I don't think Shearer, you didn't see much of Shearer, but I don't know whether he was there at that time. But yeah, you'd see players in there all the time drinking. Whereas drinking in football now, the culture we talked about earlier has changed. It's shifted.
Mm.
They know that alcohol affects sleep, performance, blah blah blah. It's not good for club relations. It's not good for player relations. But I also, on the same hand, we had a it wasn't Premier League. It was in fact, no, where was it? Premier League? Yes, they'd have been in the Premier League at the time. We had a Premier League footballer lived opposite us, and it was just literally Deliveroo after Deliveroo after Deliveroo. It was insane. I've never seen anybody clearly can't cook, right? But that's a problem, right? So he should have a nutritionist, and he should be spending some of his wages on getting someone in to cook for him. But
Yeah.
instead, it's just Deliveroo, Deliveroo, Deliveroo. It was insane, like 3 or 4 times a day. There'd be a Deliveroo driver would turn up and guaranteed that the food they're getting isn't great quality food, right?
No.
By default. And I was like, and there's the side of me that's going, he's going to have a short career. And again, I might actually look him up and see if he's still playing. But he was just a young lad at this club,
Yeah.
but nobody had advised him. And I feel a little bit of empathy towards that. I'm like, there's a lot of these young kids don't know what they're meant to be doing.
Yeah.
They're just winging it, but they're looking at their peers and going, "Well, all my peers play PlayStation till 3 o'clock in the morning because I'm chatting to them on my mic, and
Mm.
so they follow the culture. So it's how do we get into those cultures and start to change them? And it's a long process. You know, we're not going to get uniform change in a club in a year. We can go in and we can start to implement things and start to look at things and start to move those cultures around these things. But also education plays a massive part, you know. So
100%. No, it's such a good point. And I think that that's the key, isn't it? Because like I said before, you can, if you ask players about the most important recovery tool, a lot of them will probably mention sleep without thinking about how they're actually impacting the sleep. So everything that you're doing and speaking about, I think is really, really important. So I really appreciate you coming back on, Phil. I think we've expanded on things. I think it's interesting going into this season with these different times of kickoffs and challenges that clubs and players will face. So hopefully people listen to this and take plenty from it. But just on that, where would you direct people? People want to keep up with what you've got going on.
I still, again, I'm going through an Instagram name change, which is like pulling teeth. But I've coached coaches for years, so my Instagram handle is actually the PT coach.
Yeah.
Which I was responsible for coaching coaches. Whereas I'm trying to revert it back to my name because again, I'm doing a lot more public speaking, corporate stuff, and things like this now. And again, personal brand we talked about. So you'll find me at the PT coach on my personal profile, Human24, HMN24, which you'll find the website is hmn24.com. The Instagram handle is hmn24 underscore. So again, feel free to look on there. We do a load of stuff around circadian modulation, which again is sleep wake management, jet lag mitigation, which again is anyone who's either has irregular social schedules or travels a lot. And we also look at arousal state management, which again is kind of what we were talking about with the stimulants and sedatives, depressants, blah blah blah. So that's what we do as a brand, and that's what our products are designed for. So human24.com, and you'll be able to find me on the PT coach and human24 underscore.
Brilliant, Phil. Thanks a lot for coming back on. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.